website SEPS 2020 and visit this specific panel's page, you'll see that we've compiled some resources that will be helpful in understanding the perspectives we were hoping that Keolu could bring today. So please do make sure to visit that web page for additional resources. After we move through the initial questions period, there will be an open Q&A section for you all to participate, and we just request that you line up by the mic on the left side of the room to ask any questions you may have. And for the Zoom participants, there is a moderator who's going to help you get your questions answered. So with no further ado, I will introduce our panelists and a bit about what we hope to achieve today. So our first panelist is Dr. Sarah Vanja. She serves as the lead for the stakeholder communication at Pairwise, a food and tech company committed to building a healthier world through better fruits and vegetables. Prior to joining Pairwise, Sarah was a professor at the Boyce Thompson Institute for Plant Research on the campus of Cornell University. There, she served as the founding director of the Alliance for Science, a global communications effort that aims to improve science literacy and science-informed policymaking across a range of science issues, including agricultural biotechnology. For 12 years, Sarah was based in international programs in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell. There, she held positions including the Senior Associate Director of the Durable Rust Resistance in Wheat Project and Senior Associate Director of International Programs. At IP Cows, Sarah was instrumental in launching the Cows Initiative AWARE, standing for Advancing Women in Agriculture Through Research and Education, which promotes women in agriculture. Sarah is the 2021 Borlaug Cast Communication Award winner and a senior fellow at the Breakthrough Institute. Sarah received her Ph.D. in plant biology from Cornell University in 2009. She completed a BA in biology at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Sarah grew up in a small agricultural village in northwest Illinois and now enjoys life in the Finger Lakes with her 3 children. And Dr. Matthew Schnorr is an associate professor in the Department of International Development Studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, Chipuktik, Mi'kmaq unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people. Trained as an environmental geographer, he has spent 15 years investigating the potential for new agricultural technologies to alleviate poverty and hunger for smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. He is the author of Africa's Gene Revolution, Genetically Modified Crops and the Future of African Agriculture, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2019. We're so delighted to have you both here today for an important and hopefully interesting conversation about the role that biotechnology can play in agricultural equity. This conversation will seek to describe how biotechnological interventions like genetically modified crops or gene editing may be able to play a role in benefiting the livelihoods of the most marginalized in the global populace. Using both historical perspectives and their vast experiences, we hope to draw out your vision for an equitable future food system and how biotechnology might be able to fit in that vision for this goal. So with no further ado, I thank you both for being here, and let's get started. So to start, I was hoping to hear from each of you about your perspectives on what extent you think agricultural biotechnology has been a mechanism for promoting equity to date. And to follow up on that question, what do you feel are the largest limitations of its efficacy? And I'll allow either of you who's feeling inspired to get going.
Okay, I'm happy to start. Hi, everyone. Before I answer the question, you want me to get closer? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I'll just tell you a bit about me. So my name is Matthew. I'm the descendant of Ashkenazi Jews who fled Poland and Germany in the early 20th century. My grandfather, I'm from Toronto originally, was the first Jewish hematologist in Toronto. So when I was growing up, I was really close to my grandfather, and I just assumed, and I think everyone in my family just assumed I was going to become a doctor. So I started my undergraduate degree, and I studied biology, cell biology, microbiology. I was in the lab. And it took me a couple of years to realize that I wasn't very good at science. So I pivoted in my 4th year and on a whim took a social science class and figured that I could look at these same technologies, but through more of a social and political lens. So I shifted in the PhD again to examine the introduction of agricultural biotechnology, especially in South Africa, looking at efforts by settlers and scientists to impose cotton as a commodity crop in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the eastern province in South Africa. I got the PhD, and when I got the PhD, my grandmother, who was then 95, she said to me, "Matthew, Mazel Tov, we're so happy. Would you consider going back to school to become a doctor?" So to her great disappointment, I got a job at Dalhousie. So Dalhousie is a university in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. It's on the eastern seaboard of our country. It's also, that of course is the colonial name. The real name for Halifax is Timbuktu in Mi'kmaq. And as Nicholas said, this is the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. It's a really interesting history in Atlantic Canada because when the British first arrived in the early 17th century, they were floundering. And the Mi'kmaq people, of course, who've lived there for thousands of years, formed this alliance with the British. And there was a series of treaties in the early 17th and mid-18th centuries between the Mi'kmaq and the British that are literally called the Peace and Friendship Treaties. And these are treaties of mutual obligation and long-term promises. And really interestingly, they do not involve any ceding of land or access to resources. Within the landscape of Canadian Indigenous settler relations makes Atlantic Canada unique. So today, the Supreme Court has affirmed the right of the Mi'kmaq to utilize their land, utilize their resources, and this manifests itself in very interesting Indigenous and settler relations. So Mi'kmaq have the right to hunt and fish and collect what's known as a moderate livelihood. And right now, there's this conflagration around Mi'kmaq fishers, lobster fishers, who are able to operate outside of controlled times, met with huge resistance and indeed violence by settler fishers, which led to arson in a lobster store that was selling or buying from Mi'kmaq fishers. So it's a very interesting place in terms of Indigenous settler relations. Since my appointment at Dalhousie, my research, as Nicholas said, is focused on the potential for agricultural biotechnology to alleviate poverty and hunger in Africa. I started working in South Africa. I did some work with my friend Brian here, looking at questions of BT cotton in Burkina Faso and also BT cowpea in Ghana. Most of my work is in Uganda. I've been doing research with farmers there for about 12 years, looking at genetically modified versions of the toke banana, which is the primary carbohydrate in Uganda. And we've got a lot of projects looking at questions of gender and intra-household dynamics around new and improved varieties. And now we're looking at gene editing and the potential for gene-edited crops to improve yields and livelihoods for smallholder farmers in Uganda and in Kenya and Ghana as well. Okay, so that was just a bit of background. Now I'll get to Nicholas's great first question. I love the question. As researchers, we spend so much time looking forward. This first question prompts us to look back. And so when I look back, and I'm going to focus on the empirical record of genetically modified crops as a potential for promoting equity. I've actually spent some time over the past couple weeks looking at some of the early assessments in the 70s and 80s of the potential for genetically modified crops to alleviate poverty and reduce hunger. And it's incredible. People were describing genetically modified crops as miraculous. There's this op-ed in the New York Times in the late 80s that says our potential for genetic modification is limited only by our imagination. Well, what we can say unequivocally at this point is that the reality has not matched the rhetoric. There are significant limitations, and those are scientific, and they're political, and they're regulatory. If you look at the landscape of genetically modified crops today, 98% of all genetically modified crops grown are either herbicide tolerant or insect resistant. And these are technologies that help large-scale producers use less labor and use less pesticides and expand monocrop production. And they've been very successful at doing that, especially, of course, on the big four commodity crops of soya, maize, canola, and cotton. When you look at the empirical record of transplanting these herbicide-tolerant and insect-resistant technologies into small-scale African farmer systems, where I do the majority of my work, the record's really poor. And we see that in South Africa, where there was a very enabling environment that disappeared after a while, and smallholder farmers just aren't growing BT cotton anymore. In Burkina Faso, where Brian's work has really showcased the issues with introgressing, taking the BT trait into local varieties, and the government eventually abandoning that project. There's a lot more enthusiasm nowadays for what I call second generation genetically modified crops. So these are crops, orphan crops, crops like cassava or matoke banana or cowpea, public-private partnerships. So these aren't confined by intellectual property restrictions. And there's a lot of enthusiasm about the potential for this next generation of GM crops to enhance equity and alleviate poverty. Again, the research that I've seen, I remain quite skeptical because there's a lot of reasons to believe that these types of technologies are going to exacerbate some existing inequities as opposed to rectify them. So I will leave it there because that was a long time to talk. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here. I was reflecting with Nicholas this morning that the last time I was here was Super Tuesday, March 2nd, 2020, and I gave my last in-person talk that day before the pandemic really changed our lives. So it's so nice to be back here and in this new era where we can meet face to face again, and to meet again so many old friends, and then to put some names to faces of people I've known, but haven't actually been able to meet in person. So great to be here. I am, as Nicholas said, recently I've transitioned from academia to a startup, and so I'm happy to talk to any of you students who are kind of at that critical juncture in your career where you're thinking about different career opportunities. I've certainly taken kind of a circuitous route in my own career. But I would say that an overarching theme is that I'm a very solutions-oriented optimist, and I'm really excited about the work that we're doing at Pairwise to really improve the diets and nutrition of Americans, but also people around the world. So, to Nicholas's question, I'll say that, I'm nodding in agreement with Matthew here because it's absolutely true. I mean, the biotechnologies of, the 1990s and the 2000s absolutely did not live up to their potential, right? As Matthew correctly points out, what do we have, like 190 million hectares of GMO crops out there growing in the world, and 99% of that is 4 crops. 50% soy, 30% corn, I think it's 15% cotton, and 4% canola. So, a real lost opportunity for the majority of the crops that are important for the nutrition of people. And as Matthew correctly points out, most of those crops, 99% of those crops contain one of 2 traits: herbicide tolerance, insect resistance, or combinations of those traits. And so for me, it's been a lost opportunity. But I would say that it's less due to science than to social issues, politics, the inability for policymakers to stand with the science. And we've seen how important that is throughout this pandemic, right? When policymakers make decisions that aren't informed by science. And so I think, it really is, I think, a missed opportunity for the improvement of so many crops around the world. That said, I do think that there's no reason why, politics and social pressures aside, why the tools of biotechnology cannot help improve equity around the world. And if we look and sort of zoom in on some cases where we have seen innovation in crops that are important for food and feeding people, we do see success stories. So when the political and social environment is one that is enabling, when it is one where local scientists can innovate to solve problems for farmers in their countries, we do see an improvement in livelihoods. And the case in Bangladesh, I think, is sadly one of the few ones that we have to point to, but it's a great example of where Bangladeshi researchers did use one of those traits, BT, to introduce that into eggplant and make that eggplant resistant to its most devastating pest, the fruit and shoot borer. And that technology was available to smallholder farmers across Bangladesh. This is, a rare case where you had a minister of agriculture who was adamant that this technology is not going to bypass the poor farmers of Bangladesh. We're going to benefit from biotechnology too. That was the Honorable Matia Chowdhury, who was then the Minister of Agriculture. She's not the Minister of Agriculture anymore. But those farmers started growing the eggplant in 2014, and after it was approved in 2013. And so we have several years of data now, and what those data show is that not only does this technology have a great environmental benefit with, on average, something like 62% reduced insecticide use, which is great for the environment, but it also has resulted in a 6-fold increase in farmers' income. And I mean, you can do the math on your graduate student stipend. What would happen to your life if your income increased by 6-fold? Like, that would be pretty sweet, right? Bye-bye student loans. But you know, in Bangladesh, that means going from making $3 a day to making $18 a day, and that's really transformative. And so I'll just say that, you know, while I think biotechnology and specifically GMOs sadly has not, quote unquote, lived up to its potential, it's really due to these social and political factors, and that the science itself still holds a lot of promise. And so if we can continue to drive these, you know, continue to support enabling environments that allow countries to make their own decisions about, you know, what scientists want to study and what problems that farmers are facing that they want to respond to, then I think we could see more innovation that will actually help us achieve these challenges of feeding our countries while at the same time having minimal impact on the environment. Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you to each of you for those really thoughtful responses, and actually that leads us really nicely into our next question. I think you both reflected that there are cases or where traits were limiting, and I want to reflect a bit more on the limitations of the technology that you each described. And so Dr. Matthew Schnorr, in your book, you reflect on how biotechnological interventions in Africa, and you state technologies in their individual contexts cannot be understood in isolation. And I think you both reflected in your responses to the first question how that has been a limitation in the past. I wonder if we can think through that a bit. And so my question to each of you is, how do we begin the process of understanding agricultural biotechnology within the context that it stands to be relevant within? And Sarah, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Well, I didn't write the book, so I'm interested to hear Matthew's response. But I would say that, you know, in general, you know, it's so important to listen, right? And I think as you know, how many in this room, we haven't really taken a poll to figure out who's in the room and who our audience is. Like, how many of you are doing social science research? How many of you are doing biology, chemistry research? Okay, that's interesting. So I think as scientists, we tend to sort of, you know, get excited about how our technology can solve problems, right? I mean, we don't get into this business of doing science, for example, to, you know, write grant proposals or to to write reports for the grants that we get. I mean, we do this because we want to have impact, right? We want to make a difference. And so as scientists, we think about the tools that we have to make a difference. And sometimes we don't do enough listening. So I think that we have great tools today in 2022 to solve big problems or to help solve big problems. But in order to do it right, we have to do the listening. And so, you know, being demand driven, you know, finding out what farmers want, what farmers need before we embark on an innovation crusade, I think is really important. But that said, when technologies are out there and when they're available, you know, I think farmers need to be able to choose. They need to have the access and the ability to choose what solutions are going to work in their specific system, right? So none of us over here in Berkeley, California, or Ithaca, New York, where I live, know what's best for a farmer in rural India, for example. And so I think being able to support the enabling environments that allow farmers to make the best choices for them in their specific context is really key. And then in order for those farmers to have access to technologies that are going to be relevant, the scientists in those countries need to be able to use the tools to innovate, to address those challenges that are specific to those communities. And I'm really excited about the news that came over the wire recently about IGI and UC Davis continuing to build on their success with the African Plant Breeders Academy. I think it's really great and it's the way we do science today, to form these international collaborations, right, to support each other in doing good science. So that's really great. But at the end of the day, I think, to quote my good friend Patricia Nanteza from Uganda, who says it best, we have to let Africa speak for herself. We have to let India speak for herself. We Westerners, I think, have a tendency to sort of go into sort of a white savior mentality, right, where we want to go and we want to save the world. But the best thing that we can do is to be good collaborators and essentially to let people address and solve the problems that are most relevant for their communities themselves. So, over to you, Matthew.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what Sarah just said, and I apologize for missing the opportunity to raise my hand. Definitely a social scientist, so the three of us in the room should get together at some point. You think about the context in which this conversation is taking place, right? We're at one of the most prestigious universities in North America. We're speaking in English. Most of us have advanced university degrees. Think about the context in which I do most of my work, in rural Uganda, where most farmers don't have running water or electricity. These are subsistence farmers who are producing for themselves and maybe selling a bit excess at the market. Very little access to capital, difficulty getting their crops to market, no access to credit. There's only so much value in having a conversation in this context about technology that's going to work in that context. And yet this is exactly what people who look like me have been doing for the better part of 300 years, right? Whether it's in London or Paris or DC or Tokyo, you have experts who have been super excited about new generations of agricultural technology, going all the way back to improved seeds and irrigation and mechanization, chemical fertilizers, marker-based selection, tissue culture. And what we know unequivocally is that you cannot transplant technology designed for a system of industrialized, large-scale, heavily capitalized, monocropped agriculture and plop it down in a smallholder farming system and expect it to work, because it never does. So I agree with Sarah that we have to reimagine this focus on technology transfer. It is broken. So two concrete suggestions for how to do this, and both of these are empirically validated within the peer-reviewed social scientific scholarship. The first is reimagining technology transfer as technology co-development or co-learning. Well, the goal is to help smallholder farmers start with smallholder farmers. If we want to reach, if the beneficiaries aren't involved in the technology development from the initial stages, the chances of success are extraordinarily low. And you see so often that farmer consultation or farmer participation is treated by scientists as a box that needs to be checked. Yes, we convened a focus group, farmers been consulted. We need to reimagine technology transfer as technology co-development to ensure that farmers are integrated in meaningful ways throughout the entirety of the project cycle. And that goes all the way to the conceptualization and the grant, the starting point of the questions that we're going to ask. And there are lots of examples of how to do this that have been validated in both experimental settings and also real-world settings. The second point here is that we need to think beyond the genome and not just talk about genomic level change, but talk about system level change. So this mode of breeding that has dominated since the colonial era is one constraint, one solution. So even BT brinjal, you're focusing on one particular insect, right? The fruit and shoot borer, right? as opposed to the cocktail of pests that affect brinjal. And so one of the things you're seeing coming out of the case study in Bangladesh is that the incidence of these secondary pests is actually increasing because you're only focusing on one of them. So we need to focus on plant breeding that incorporates multiple traits simultaneously. And more broadly, we need to embrace this notion of complexity, not just in ecological systems, but also the complexity of farming systems that comprise agricultural, ecological, but also political, economic, and social components. You know, where I think Sarah and I disagree is I don't see the science and the politics as separate. I see them as integrated. And so seed-based tech improvements like gene editing are only going to prove advantageous if they're accompanied by an enabling environment. On that, we totally agree. So we need to talk about supportive structures that are in place: credit, market, extensions, storage. You know, changing a plant's genome is much easier than changing a farming system. There are fewer variables to control, there's fewer actors to consult, there's fewer barriers in the form of policy and politics and people. But any benefits associated with genome enhancement cannot be realized unless we move beyond the genome and start having these conversations at the level of systems. Thanks.
Thank you to each of you for your thoughtful responses. It's quite fitting that our next question has to do with new technology, given your response, Matthew. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about CRISPR-Cas9 or gene editing broadly and its capacities to offer new advantages or opportunities for biotechnology and for being able to promote equity in this space.
Am I going to go first this time?
Whatever you each want.
I took a big dramatic intake of breath. We'll switch next time, or do you want to?
Sure.
Go first?
No, I can start here. So, you know, I agree with everything Matthew said. You know, technology is just part of the full picture, right? And the world is complex, right? And so we need to be working in partnership. We need to break through our silos, work across disciplines, work across sectors in order to actually ensure that the technology that those of us in science are so passionate about actually has impact. Because it's not as simple as just tweaking a genome. That said, I think, you know, we do have a role to play as genomicists, right? We do have a role to play in helping ensure that, you know, people have access to safe, nutritious food while at the same time minimizing food production's impact on the environment. So to sort of say like, okay, all of you who are focused on the genome, you know, this is too complex a problem for you because you're narrowing on A, T's, and G's and C's. I would say like, no, we have a role. We have a role to play, but we need absolutely to work across silos and work across sectors. And, you know, I think, you know, many technologies are scale neutral. Many technologies, you know, you can apply them in so many different ways. And I think that's why the world is so excited about CRISPR, right? I mean, people know what it stands for. They're excited about gene editing. People, journalists are excited about gene editing. It's a really, it's a tool I think that has provided some glimmer of hope, whether you're talking about addressing diseases like sickle cell anemia or addressing the challenges that we face in producing food with a looming climate crisis. So, you know, I don't want to discount the role that all of you young innovators who are pioneering this technology have to play in helping us address these challenges. And I think scientists around the world, particularly young scientists, are excited about being able to harness the power of CRISPR to work on crops that are important in their country contexts and to deliver improved technologies to their farmers and also to their consumers. And while access to the technology undoubtedly is limited in a lot of places because it's new, right? And you know, the diffusion of technology can take time, but certainly there are a number of scientists that I've read about or met who are using this technology to try to address real issues in their country contexts. Sam Achapong in Ghana using CRISPR to improve sweet potato so that it has higher amounts of provitamin A that can help address vitamin A deficiency. You know, there's a young scientist excited about using CRISPR to improve crops that are relevant to Ghana. Lena Tripathi at IATA in Kenya using CRISPR to help improve banana to fight disease. Scientists working on cassava, a young scientist, Navneet Kaur, in India, working on applying CRISPR to improve banana in the context of India. So, I mean, the question, you know, does CRISPR offer new advantages or opportunities to promote equity through biotechnology? Absolutely. Will it solve the problems alone? Will it, you know, work in a vacuum? No. We have to also deal with these social and political challenges that Matthew points out. So I mean, I was so inspired at breakfast today to hear about so many scientists who are wrapping up their PhDs and looking at getting into policy work. So yes, we have to work across disciplines and across silos.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of excitement about CRISPR. I think it's too early to say because there are no empirical examples I know of where gene-edited crops have been released with the goal of enhancing smallholder systems. I think what we can say for sure at this point is that the only way to answer the question is to measure it. And one thing that concerns me greatly is that the social scientific evaluation of the potential for new technology to alleviate poverty and hunger lags way behind the scientific study of the technology itself. So how many peer-reviewed studies are out there about CRISPR? I'm guessing it's not hundreds, it's probably thousands at this point, right? How many peer-reviewed studies are out there that are peer-reviewed studies examining the potential for gene editing to help smallholder farming systems? There are basically 24, maybe 36. And that discrepancy between the amount of science being conducted on these issues and the amount of social science being conducted on these issues, that's a problem, whether you're a scientist or whether you're a social scientist. Because you need good social science alongside good science to figure out whether new technologies are actually going to translate into gains for people on the ground. What we know unequivocally from the social scientific scholarship on the introduction of new technologies is that it's going to do good and it's going to do harm. It's going to produce winners and it's going to produce losers. And so if you look at a lot of the case studies around genetically modified crops in Africa, you know, I've done on smallholder systems. We need studies that explore the complexity of farmer decision making. We can't assume that farmers will choose increased yields over time because we have lots of data to show that smallholder farmers have much more complex decision making than just yields. Many examples of African farmers foregoing yields in favor of value-based characteristics like poundability or taste or color or something like that. Also lots of examples of smallholder farmers being much more risk averse than larger scale farmers. We also need robust comparisons between gene-edited crops and other alternatives to improve farming systems, which we don't have a lot of when we look backwards at other technologies. So I'll ground this emphasis on social science in a specific example. Nicholas and Sarah collaborated on a paper last year that examined the application of gene editing for climate change in agriculture. It's a terrific paper, and it does a really good job, as Sarah was just doing, of just running through the potential that gene editing has for increasing drought tolerance and enhancing nutritional quality, helping with tolerance of soil salinity. I mean, the article reads as almost, you know, it's seething with optimism. What I kept thinking to myself as I was reading the article is, where are the people? You know, you've got this suite of amazing gene editing technologies, and you've got these, you know, billions of people on the planet who are in dire need of improved farming systems. But to get in the middle is people, right? And power, and politics, and systems. That's where we social scientists live. And we're gonna need to understand that bridging process in order for any of this technological optimism to translate into real life benefits. I could just keep going like this, but I'll stop.
Well, the message is received, and I'm going to keep doing this as well. Thank you each for your responses. So I really appreciate kind of the historical perspectives and the real life examples that we were able to reflect on in our initial responses. And now I want to challenge each of you to imagine your ideal food system. Imagine what that might look like. And to what extent do you think that biotechnology will help us achieve that reality?
Go for it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so my take-home message here is we need to obsess over the problem, not the solution. So the first part of Nicholas's question, envisioning an achievable ideal food system. I would say we got to lower the bar because I think that all of us in this room recognize that the global food system is broken. If the purpose of the global food system is to feed people, then it's doing a really shitty job, right? Because we all know that we have more calories on the planet right now to feed every living human being, and yet the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that there are just under 1 billion people who are facing acute hunger right now. So if we're going to improve this broken system, then we need to obsess over the problem, not the solution. If we obsess over the solution, then the question is, how can poor farmers benefit from biotechnology? If we obsess over the problem, then the question becomes, how can some of the most brilliant people on the planet help to improve agricultural productivity and reduce poverty for billions of people? This second question is much more important than the former. So, because this question opens up the door to lots of different potential solutions. You know, the farmers who I work with in Uganda, they are desperate for improved technology, for improved seeds. And Sarah is 100% right. Plant breeders and biotechnologists have a crucial role to play here. But these farmers want lots of other things as well. You know, no one's dedicating, yesterday Nicholas gave me this great tour of the Innovations for Genomics Institute, which is awesome. It's so shiny, you know? But there's no Innovations in Road Paving Institute, right? Because road paving is boring, and we know how to do it. And no one's winning a Nobel Prize for increasing market access or irrigation or better storage. But these less sexy interventions are often the ones that are most crucial to change lived outcomes. So biotech is a piece of the puzzle, for sure. But it's a big puzzle. It's not one of those, you know, with my kids, I do those puzzles where it's like a truck and there's 4 pieces. It's not that kind of puzzle, right? It is a big puzzle. And oftentimes I have these conversations with scientists where it's clear that for them, I get the sense that they see the rest of the puzzle is complete. And biotech, if we insert a gene-edited version of this crop, then the whole picture comes into view. I'll just continue with the puzzle metaphor. Like the puzzle's still in the box, right? If you look at rates of agricultural productivity in Africa today, they're basically the same as they were 60 years ago. A gene-edited crop is not going to fix that problem. The goal here has to be systems-level based change. Seed-based improvements are a part of this, but they're definitely only one piece.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're kind of echoing each other, and absolutely we need systems level thinking. And I'll say again, I mean, we really need to break out of our silos in order to be able to have that big thinking and all bring our specific areas of expertise to the table to tackle these enormous challenges. I mean, if we want to re-envision a new food system, none of us in this room can do that, right? We absolutely need to work with people across sectors, and I think, you know, that's what's missing. I mean, we have a global conversation happening right now, which was very well. This was well articulated by some folks from the Chicago Council in a piece that came out a couple weeks ago. that like we have these great conversations happening and big commitments being made by countries around food security and agriculture, right? Producing more calories. We have great conversations happening right now, and that was like the Food System Summit happened last year, right? So we talked about food. We have the climate COP, right? We're talking about climate. We've got nutrition summits. We're talking about nutrition, but these big conversations aren't happening across these big issues, and that's what's needed, because food, access to food and nutrition and agriculture and climate, they are inextricably linked. Like we have to be having one conversation, and that's not what we're having at the Food Systems Summit. The word CRISPR or gene editing basically wasn't uttered, right? I mean, it was completely sidelined from that conversation. You go to the climate COP, and food and agriculture aren't being discussed, right? Even though agriculture is a major contributor to climate change. So if we can't have one conversation, then we're not going to be able to have the right expertise and the right perspectives to be able to truly envision a better food system moving forward, which is, I think we can all agree on, as Matthew says, absolutely needed in order to overcome these huge challenges that we face today. So let's break down those silos. Let's have an open mind and start talking to people from other sectors, from other disciplines, and so that we can start to have a more constructive conversation. And I would also add to that while making commitments is all good and well, commitments don't always translate into action. And right now, I think that the situation is urgent enough that we need to stop talking about commitments, so we need to all move toward action.
I thank you each for dreaming with me a bit, and also for bringing a pragmatic perspective. And so I'd like to root us back to this place where we're coming from, where most of us are affiliated with this university somehow. And I'm really curious about what are the capacities of folks and systems like universities or even companies to ever really successfully account for these disparate realities and the lived realities of smallholder farmers, of indigenous groups, or other decentralized or marginalized communities. As you both articulated, these conversations need to be had, and I'm curious, what is our role here in having those conversations?
I'd say that universities are really good at convening opportunities like this to discuss these big issues. And I think that the responsibility that we have as fairly effective conveners is to try to diversify the voices that are at the table, right? So I mean, here we are all talking about food and agriculture. Probably none of us actually grow the food we consume. How many of you are farmers? So like, where's that voice, right? And so I think that's the responsibility that we have, is to really elevate more voices, so that, and then for those of us who are used to professing and talking a lot, we just need to do a heck of a lot more listening.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, talking about institutions, those of us who work and study at universities, work at corporations, other powerful institutions like, bilateral development donors or philanthropic organizations, we occupy tremendous positions of power and privilege. As Sarah said, we live in a bubble that's so far removed from the daily lived realities of smallholder farmers, it makes it impossible for us to account for those. So what do? We reform our institutions and our systems and elevate the role played by beneficiary communities within the technology development process. When I was growing up, my grandmother always talked about the golden rule, right? The person who has the gold makes the rules. Well, universities and private companies and donors, they have the gold. So the question is, are they willing to shift the rules of the game to allow meaningful representation and accountability to the people who are ostensibly the end users of the technology? As an aside, I mean, another more radical solution to the golden rule would actually be to share the gold. Among social scientists, academics, and activists, we talk a lot about that, but that seems beyond the parameters of this panel right now. So, these institutions have the gold. What kind of rules are they willing to establish? I mean, at universities, we talk a lot about The things that Sarah was talking about, partnership, right? Participation, sustainability, inclusion. You know, Sarah, your point about breaking down silos. Totally. The difficulty is, though, who's calling for more silos, right? Who's arguing for less sustainability? No one. We all agree on those words. The rub is, what does that actually mean in practice? Because one person's partnership is another person's asymmetrical power relationship. So I do think we need to dig deeper. When you know, the partnerships that I've seen be successful are those that foundationally focus on relationship building over the long term. And that means relationship building at the farmer level. So we need to reform our institutions to create more downward rather than upward accountability. We need to reform these institutions away from technology transfer towards tech co-development. What does that mean in practice? Concrete suggestions. Less ambitious in terms of timeline and expectations in order to integrate farmers in a meaningful way at every point in the project cycle. We need to facilitate regular encounters between researchers and farmers. We need to restore farmers' roles as pilots of farming systems. We need to fund experimental programs that have explicit and protected time for this type of exchange. Forums that, as Sarah said, is not just made up of people who don't farm, but of people who do farm in order to facilitate this type of co-learning. So, you know, this new way of doing things is going to cost more money, and it's going to go a little bit slower. And that sucks. But if we want the future of technological investment to differ from the historical record of technological investment, we're going to have to change the rules of the game. So we are going to have to amend the golden rule. We're going to have to give up some of these power asymmetries that constrain the current model of donor-driven development.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to invite our audience members who have been sitting on questions to either move over to the mic to ask any questions that are on their minds, or raise their hand and the mic can be delivered to you. While that's happening, I just want to say what a gift it is as an early career scientist who is thinking about technology to have each of you here reflecting from your vast experiences. It feels like such an incredible opportunity. So I'm very sincerely grateful for each of you and your experiences.
Well, I feel so inspired by all of you, and I really appreciate the conversations over breakfast, so thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great panel discussion. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on to what extent labor, like when I think of agriculture and equity, I'm really thinking about labor practices, at least in the US. So I wonder if you could expand a bit on to what extent labor organizers, groups that sort of support farmers and people who are harvesting food in the US or elsewhere are involved in these conversations about biotechnology and gene editing and so forth.
That's a lot there. So how is labor involved in the conversations about gene editing, or how are labor advocacy groups involved in the conversations around gene editing? Probably not enough, is what I would say. But I think there's a few different reasons for that. When you talk to grower organizations, and actually I was talking to one yesterday, Western growers, down in the Salinas Valley, you know, they're not talking a lot about gene editing because they've got like 50 other things that are more pressing, right? So they're worried about even having labor, for one thing. That's a big issue. They're worried about you know, different pest pressures. They're worried about water. I mean, water is a huge can of worms here in California, right? So gene editing is pretty low on the list of issues that labor advocacy organizations are talking about, or that growers are talking about, or that the laborers themselves obviously are talking about. So that said, you know, when you think about like, well, what kinds of traits would be good for growers? So, for example, this woman that I was talking to yesterday, so they have a huge labor shortage, labor issues, and you know, a lot of it's, you know, moving toward mechanization so that you can offer people interesting vocational jobs and automation as opposed to being the backbreaking work of actually doing agricultural labor and picking. And so she was saying, oh, we're not really thinking about gene editing, but if you could come up with a broccoli with a longer stem, that would really help us out, right? So there are these kinds of traits that could have great labor benefits. One of the things that we're doing at Pairwise, it's not a singular improvement, but along with a suite of other improvements in BlackBerry, we're trying to make a thornless BlackBerry, which has great benefits for the mostly women who pick the blackberries, right? And so I think that we can use tools we can use the tools of gene editing to address traits that will benefit the people actually doing the agricultural labor. But, you know, there's the conversations that I'm having indicate that, like, the gene editing conversation is pretty low on their mind. They're not waking up thinking about gene editing. But that's not to say that it isn't important to do that outreach and start talking to those groups now. And that's something I'm thinking a lot about as I work on our ESG strategy for Pairwise, because we're growing food, right? And so what do we need to keep in mind in terms of the needs and the challenges that the people who are actually producing that food are facing? So it's something I'm thinking a lot about, but I don't have any great answers for you right now. Check back with me in 6 months.
Yeah, I don't have the expertise to answer that. I don't live in this country. I don't study this country. What I will say about how labor dynamics play out in Africa is, of course, it's very different because most Africans are farmers and laborers, right? You see a difference with tenant farmers, especially in South Africa and southern Zimbabwe. But in the rest of the continent, the people who are doing the farmer and their spouses and their children are the ones laboring on the farms. And so what this means is that the questions about gene editing and the phenotypic benefits that will result have enormous implications for at the household level. So some of the research we did on Uganda looked at how a genetically modified version of cooking banana that was resistant to this pernicious disease, which is called banana bacterial wilt, would result in increased yield because the plant wouldn't be damaged by disease. That meant that there's going to be more work in terms of planting and especially harvesting and weeding and cutting leaves. And we found that much of that additional work, that additional labor, was going to be taken on by the woman in the household as opposed to the man. So those labor dynamics are really important to foreground when we're talking about potential benefits because they often mediate those benefits in very subtle ways.
That's a really great point. I'll put a plug in for my former colleague, Holly Tufan. Those of you who are in crop improvement and plant breeding, she built a program that is led by Macquarie University called GREAT, and this is Gender Responsive Researchers Equipped for Agricultural Transformation. That's what it stands for. And the idea behind the program was, you know, as plant breeders, we can't all be gender experts, right? We all want to do the right thing, but we don't have the expertise. So how can we get, you know, at least some tools to work with, or how can we learn to, you know, keep in mind the needs of the people actually producing the food, which, as Matthew points out, are often women laboring, and so that when we're setting our breeding priorities, we're taking their needs into account. And so it's a great program, and they do training courses all the time for breeders to be more responsive to those needs. Google it, it's great.
I just want to keep us focused on time. We have about 12 minutes left in the session, and it seems like 6 or 7 questions. So just as you're gearing your responses.
Do we want to collect a few questions and then answer? Will that help save time?
I think let's see what questions roll through, and then we can respond accordingly.
Hi, thank you. You've given great suggestions so far on how we can improve the conditions for small-scale farmers, and I really appreciate the focus on this portfolio of solutions to improve their farming conditions. And of course, radical change of system-wide enabling partnerships between universities and farmers is going to have a very large impact, but what can someone that is an early career researcher do as an individual or focus their future work on to improve these conditions? What kind of policies can we help put forward? What individual activities would you suggest?
I think I may answer this question not the way you want to, but I think as a young researcher, do what you're passionate about, and then you'll find the right ways. Do lots of listening, follow your heart, do what you're passionate about, and you'll find ways to have impact. It's a very vague answer, but it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Do what you love. Focus on, who you are and where you live, right? I think that oftentimes, I work in a Department of International Development Studies, and so one of the things that our undergraduates talk a lot about is development depression, right? The idea that the more you dig into these issues, the more complex they are and the more disempowering one feels. Those of us who work in this field, most of us don't feel that, right? We recognize the limitations of individual change, but we recognize that as individuals, we focus on individual change and we focus on large-scale institutional change at the same time. Are you going to change the world on your own? No, you're not. You play a part, and you do what you can, and you recognize that all those feelings of, incapacitation or shame or guilt or hopelessness, none of those are helpful, right? The helpful thing to do is just one foot in front of the other, keep fighting the good fight on a day-to-day basis.
Our next question comes from one of our online Zoom participants, Max Slato, who asks, I'm wondering to what extent our speakers see the relationship between biotech research and big agriculture companies as being antagonistic to the kind of collaboration they are suggesting we need to achieve with farmers and others.
So, if we think about the GMOs of the 1990s and 2000s, because of the, tremendous regulatory hurdles, the U.S. land grant system, universities, the public sector, the small businesses and startups were basically kind of cut out of the game, right? So that's why we lost a lot of innovation, and that's why 99% of the biotech crops out there are for commodity crops. So I joined a startup because I think that that's changing now with the enabling environment is more positive. We have new tools, and we have enormous challenges and a recognition of those challenges. And so, I'm all about I'm going to join a startup that is mission driven, that wants to ensure that we can. Currently, 1 in 10 American adults eats their recommended daily allowance of fruits and vegetables. That's pathetic. We've got to do better. We have these non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease that are, on the rise, and we have horrible diets in our rich country of the U.S. So, I am really passionate about the culture at this startup, our sense of mission, and really, truly trying to lower those access barriers to access a healthier diet, not just more calories, but a healthier diet. And I think that, the place we're in today, in terms of the regulatory environments, in terms of the technology, all of these externalities, it doesn't have to be about the big multinational companies. There's a lot of room for startups, and there's so many in your neighborhood that are going to be able to use these tools to innovate, to do good.
Yeah, no, I think Max hit the nail on the head here. If you look at the reason that the reality of GM crops hasn't matched the rhetoric, the major stumbling block has been corporate consolidation. And while it's true, if you look at the portfolio of gene editing technologies, that maybe Big Ag has a lower role, though you look at the number of patents that Corteva has, and then, okay, so maybe it's University of California or the MIT Broad Institute. But it's the same consolidation of intellectual property that is going to stymie the ability for gene-edited crops to help people in need. These same patterns are repeating themselves again. And so even if you look at the public-private partnerships where gene-edited crops are targeting traits and crops that matter to poor farmers, the licenses are still for experimental use, not for commercialization. Until we undermine that system, the potential for gene-edited crops to actually make a difference in the most urgent, pressing problems in the world is virtually nil.
We finally found a place of disagreement, Matthew.
We did.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the systemic solutions to the problems that you're presenting today. And so this comment comes in the context largely of US development, but I think when thinking about programs at, say, USAID, one of the consistent challenges is trying to say, how does this benefit the American taxpayer? And I think that when thinking about transferring technology to international farmers, it's a lot harder to say how that benefits the American taxpayer versus, say, giving money to an American crop producer. And so I'm curious what policy options you'd propose to kind of address that conflict of interest in some way.
Sure. I mean, I'll tackle the big bilateral development agencies. I mean, I think what is increasingly cognizant over the past couple years is that citizens of the wealthy, privileged part of the world recognize that we can't insulate ourselves from the rest of the world. And so problems of climate change and poverty and hunger, we can try to ignore them, but inevitably they are going to come onto our doorstep. And I think bilateral development agencies, and again, I speak more in the Canadian context than American, but Global Affairs Canada is increasingly changing its policy prescriptions to recognize that. It's good for our country, for other people to be doing well in theirs. Otherwise, they're all going to want to come to ours. So when you talk about concrete investments that can make a difference, we have lots of examples under the banner of agroecology, right? There are so many examples. There's a terrific project called Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities, which is in Malawi, which has over 20,000 farmers now involved in agroecological methods, farmer knowledge, focus on improving gender and nutritional outcomes. Farmer research networks funded by the McKnight Foundation. There are lots of examples of ways to invest in agricultural development that don't privilege the interests of corporations over others. So how to convince the decision makers at USAID to embrace those? I can't tell you exactly how to do that. What I would do is I would present with the evidence and say, you know, on a dollar for dollar basis, this is a way better investment than doing the same old business as usual, because you could also present them with a 60-year history of why that has failed.
Well said.
I have another question from our Zoom participant, Melinda Kliegman. So what gene-edited products are on the market today? After 10 years of CRISPR, the incredible promise and fairly lenient regulatory policies, why haven't we seen more? Also, they have spoken quite a bit about the farmer, but isn't a big part of the issue with GMOs a rejection by the consumer? How does the consumer perspective come into play here?
Great questions. Hi, Melinda. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So when we've talked several times about the GMOs of the past, you know, 2 traits, 4 crops, very much directed toward grower benefits, right? So who benefits when we are talking about herbicide tolerance or insect resistance, the people actually growing the crop and dealing with insect pressures and the need for weeding. And so consumers haven't really, in this country at least, experienced perceived benefits from GMOs. Now, in a country like where Brian works, in Burkina Faso, what is it, like 84% of people are both consumers and farmers, so that's a very different context. I might have the numbers slightly off, but something like that. Whereas in this country, 1.8% of the population is a farmer, right? So we have this distinction between farmers and consumers, and we haven't, as consumers, benefited directly from GMOs because of the traits that have been addressed. And, you know, again, this is part of what drove me to join Pairwise, because Pairwise is using this technology to actually respond to the needs of consumers, the desires of consumers, and to address some of the barriers that consumers report to having to access and consume more fruits and vegetables. And so, you know, if you ask a consumer, for example, why don't you eat more berries? Berries are great, full of anthocyanins, super healthy, superfoods. They'll say, well, I don't like the seeds. Okay, well, can we take the seeds out, right? I don't like the flavor. Well, can we improve the flavor? And if we look at sort of the consumption patterns in citrus, you know, the easy peel clementine has totally changed Americans' consumption patterns around citrus because it's convenient. As Americans, we like convenience, right? And junk food is a lot more convenient and accessible than healthy food. So how can we make healthy, nutritious food more convenient so that we can start to chip away at the obesity problem, that we can start to chip away at heart disease, we can start to chip away at type 2 diabetes. So I think that, I'm really excited about the role that CRISPR can play in helping us address the needs of consumers. So excited that I left my comfortable job and joined a startup, right? So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and you look at all the energy around using new technologies to make plant-based diets more accessible to people. So there's just so much potential. And that was one question: what's out there and why is it taking so long? Science takes a while, right? It takes plant breeding. I mean, it's not something that happens overnight, right? So, whereas it might feel like CRISPR's been around for 10 years and we don't have a lot of crops and products on the market, I think we see a lot of stuff getting pretty close. We just rolled out our consumer-facing brand a couple of weeks ago, allowed people to taste our first product, which is a super nutritious salad green. So, we're getting there, but it does take time to do crop improvement, as many of the graduate students in this room can attest.
I'll cede my time so we can get some more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great discussion. I had a specific question on regulation. And so one of the reasons that I think, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the genetic engineering and agriculture space has focused on a limited number of crops and a limited number of companies is kind of the regulatory time. I think some studies have shown about 7 years, 130 million for a single crop to move from benchtop to kind of field and application. So what are your thoughts on the regulatory changes that you would like to see to kind of enable more small stakeholder, other researchers besides large research institutes like Berkeley to kind of enter this space?
Well, I mean, it's important to recognize at the outset that the purpose of regulation is both to enable commercialization of technologies, but also to ensure that social and environmental implications of those technologies are safety is ensured. So, I look at the landscape of sort of, people talk about product-based regulation here in North America versus process-based regulation in Europe, and I look at the Norwegian model, which has sort of a triage system where they're looking at, different levels of mutagenesis, and having more intensive reviews based on the gene editing technology that's being used as one that does a pretty good job, I think, of straddling that compromise of trying to ensure there isn't an unnecessary and overly expensive burden that, you're right, can reinforce the structure where the advantages given to large-scale versus smaller-scale businesses, but also giving consumers and citizens the assurance that any foreseen or unforeseen risk is also going to be assessed and thoroughly reviewed.
Anything to add?
I would just say that when regulatory systems are based in true risk assessment and based in science, that's the best path forward, right? And so we have to assess whether these technology developments really pose risk and really be guided by the science. And I think in those cases where the regulatory system is informed as such, we'll be able to see more innovation.
We have just one final question that we can squeeze in briefly, so go for it.
Okay, thank you so much. So thanks for the talk. I loved how you both emphasized the importance of involving farmers in the research process from start to finish. And I guess my question is, how as researchers with limited resources, do we prioritize the problems that we're addressing, and how do we ensure that there's equity in that process? I mean, even if you're just working with one specific crop, and even if you're working locally, there's so many different ways to grow that crop, and there are so many different problems. And I think one of the appeals of these bigger grant-driven projects like Water Efficient Maize for Africa is someone has gone out, they've talked to people, and they've come up with this issue, and they've said, if we address this, this is the impact, and it's going to be a big impact. I don't think that's the most equitable way, but I'm wondering if you just have general thoughts on how, if we do involve farmers, we can ensure that we're choosing problems to address in a way that is equitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It can be frustrating as an individual researcher because you're right that the change is going to have to come at the institutional level. I will say that, at least in my country, I mean, the equivalent of the NSF in Canada, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and their agenda has really changed over the past 5 years, such that, you know, the focus is not just on outputs and outcomes and enduring impacts as it was in the past. The focus is really on community level change and stakeholders and participatory methodologies and knowledge dissemination. So I think there are institutions that are willing to broaden that, to ensure that there is money that's dedicated not to just to bench science, but making sure that the bench science is driven by the end users who are the intended beneficiaries. The other thing I would just say is, I mean, you know, looking into agroecology, this broad umbrella of different ways of doing, you know, science and knowledge and agriculture can open up lots of different possibilities. And I think we do need to remember that any technological formation that doesn't focus on those questions of access, control, and decision-making is not going to work. And I realize that is frustrating as an individual because what can I change? But I think open-ended conversations with your supervisor, your chair, funders, and talking about a different way of doing it has to be the way to start.
Well, that concludes our session. I'd love to thank Sarah and Matthew for their incredible wisdom, and we are so grateful for you visiting us here and sharing all your perspectives. So big round of applause to Sarah and Matthew.
Thank you.